In a dramatic and intensifying war of words, U.S. President Donald Trump has launched a scathing critique of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, accusing him of actively blocking peace efforts with Russia. Trump alleges that Zelensky's unwavering stance on Crimea is not only unrealistic but is directly contributing to the continuation of the war and the mounting loss of life. According to Trump, Ukraine's refusal to make territorial concessions, particularly around the long-disputed Crimean Peninsula, is standing in the way of what he describes as a historic opportunity to bring an end to hostilities. On April 23, 2025, in a characteristically blunt message posted on Truth Social, Trump declared, "Zelensky's statement today will do nothing but prolong the bloodshed and expand the death zone, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play must finally make it happen." Trump's statement came just 24 hours after Zelensky gave a nationally televised speech where he forcefully reiterated that Ukraine would never recognize the 2014 Russian annexation of Crimea. This position, Zelensky argued, is not negotiable and is embedded in Ukraine's national identity and legal framework. The dispute over Crimea has emerged once again as one of the most sensitive and intractable issues in ongoing diplomatic efforts, making it a major roadblock in the current round of ceasefire talks. For weeks, the United States has been spearheading behind-the-scenes efforts to broker a potential peace agreement between Kyiv and Moscow. Reports suggest that the latest proposals on the table involve Ukraine accepting a de facto loss of control over Crimea and other occupied territories in exchange for a formal ceasefire, security assurances, and potential NATO-style guarantees from Western allies. However, these ideas have faced significant backlash within Ukraine's political and military leadership, who argue that surrendering any territory would embolden Russia and set a dangerous precedent for international law. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking at a closed-door briefing in Washington, remarked that negotiations have reached a point of no return, and warned that unless meaningful compromises are made soon, the U.S. could begin disengaging from the mediation process altogether. In a parallel development, Secretary of State Marco Rubio's unexpected decision to pull out of the upcoming peace summit in London was seen by many as a sign of dwindling optimism in the American-led diplomatic initiative. Nevertheless, U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg continued lower-level talks with Ukrainian delegates in an attempt to salvage the framework. Meanwhile, conditions on the ground in Ukraine remain catastrophic. The Russian military has intensified operations in the east, where artillery shelling and drone strikes have taken a severe toll on civilian areas. One particularly deadly strike last week resulted in the deaths of 9 civilians, further fueling public pressure on both sides to find a resolution. Humanitarian agencies continue to report widespread displacement, infrastructure collapse, and growing shortages of basic medical supplies in conflict zones. As the international spotlight remains fixed on the unfolding negotiations, many are asking whether a political breakthrough is still possible. With Trump amplifying calls for compromise and Zelensky standing firm on core national principles, the stakes have never been higher. Analysts warn that what happens in the coming weeks could shape not just the future of Ukraine, but the security architecture of Europe for years to come. In a striking escalation of his ongoing criticism of U.S. foreign policy and the war in Eastern Europe, President Donald Trump has directly accused Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky of deliberately obstructing peace efforts between Ukraine and Russia. Trump has argued that Zelensky's refusal to compromise, particularly regarding the politically sensitive and strategically vital Crimean Peninsula, is not only stalling the diplomatic process, but also perpetuating a cycle of bloodshed that could have been halted months ago. According to Trump, Ukraine's firm stance is no longer just a principled position, but a costly miscalculation that risks the country's long-term survival. Speaking on Truth Social on April 23, 2025, Trump unleashed one of his most severe critiques yet. Zelensky's statement today will do nothing but prolong the bloodshed and expand the death zone, and nobody wants that. We are very close to a deal, but the man with no cards to play must finally make it happen. These remarks came just 24 hours after Zelensky reaffirmed that Ukraine would never accept Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea, labeling the region's status as non-negotiable. Zelensky stressed that recognizing Crimea as Russian would not only violate Ukraine's constitution, but also undermine the entire system of international law that defends national sovereignty and territorial integrity. This long-standing Ukrainian position has repeatedly clashed with Trump's more transactional view of diplomacy, where peace, even with compromise, is preferable to drawn-out war. In diplomatic circles, Trump's comments are being read not only as an attack on Zelensky's leadership, but also as a signal that the U.S. administration might soon shift its posture in the ongoing ceasefire negotiations. Current proposals being quietly circulated among Western allies reportedly suggest a controversial framework in which Russia would retain de facto control over Crimea and possibly other territories occupied since the 2022 invasion, in exchange for a full cessation of hostilities, withdrawal from contested zones in eastern Ukraine, and Western-backed security guarantees for Kyiv. While this approach has attracted attention as a possible off-ramp to a grinding war, it remains deeply divisive. Ukrainian officials, backed by a large segment of their population, have repeatedly rejected any peace plan that includes territorial concessions. Their argument is rooted in both history and principle, that conceding to Russian military gains would normalize aggression, weaken international law, and potentially invite future incursions. Zelensky has also expressed concern that making concessions would fracture national unity and erode public trust in government institutions, especially at a time when morale is already under strain from 2 years of warfare. The United States, under mounting pressure to end the conflict and focus on domestic priorities, has taken on an increasingly central role in mediating talks. However, the peace process has entered a critical and precarious phase. Vice President J.D. Vance recently warned that unless measurable progress is made soon, the U.S. may consider stepping back from its mediation role. That warning was underscored when Secretary of State Marco Rubio abruptly canceled his participation in the upcoming London summit on Ukraine, citing strategic recalibration. The cancellation forced organizers to downgrade the summit's format and content, signaling a loss of momentum in what many had hoped would be a breakthrough round of discussions. Nonetheless, U.S. envoy Keith Kellogg continued technical-level meetings with Ukrainian representatives in an attempt to keep the dialogue open. On the battlefield, the situation remains dire. Russian forces have intensified operations across the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions, pushing Ukrainian units into increasingly defensive positions. In one of the deadliest incidents this month, a drone attack on a residential neighborhood in eastern Ukraine resulted in 9 civilian deaths and dozens of injuries, reigniting calls from international humanitarian organizations for an immediate ceasefire. Meanwhile, refugee numbers continue to rise, and key infrastructure, especially power grids, hospitals, and roads, remains under threat or inoperable. Across Europe, governments are grappling with the war's political, economic, and security implications. NATO officials have privately expressed concern that a prolonged stalemate could further destabilize Eastern Europe, embolden other authoritarian states, and sap Western unity. At the same time, public opinion across Western democracies is increasingly divided. Some support Ukraine's firm resistance, while others question how long their nations can continue to fund a war with no clear end in sight. As Trump intensifies his rhetoric and Zelensky doubles down on principle, the fate of a continent hangs in the balance. Will pragmatism prevail over national pride and political legacy? Or will the war grind on, with diplomacy lost in the crossfire? The coming weeks may provide the answer.